Communism is more popular than it's ever been in many, many generations in the US, but also spirituality, astrology, so-called crystal therapy, things like that are also on the rise. So why is this happening? Can we just manifest a better kind of world? Today, Erica and myself are going to discuss the kinds of ideas that revolutionaries need to have in order to overthrow capitalism and fight for socialism.
Yeah, and there's very much a pervasive feeling that nothing makes sense in the world anymore, and people are looking for a way to change their circumstances. 29% of Americans believe in astrology, and nearly 40% of American women read their horoscope at least once a month. Alongside this, you have the climate crisis. You have 20% inflation between 2020 and today, right? So all of these things are linked together.
Absolutely. And I think astrology, all these things are kind of really old ideas in a sense. Some people might find it surprising that you have such a big resurgence in this period where you have very advanced scientific ideas, modern technology, and so forth. So we're going to explain a little bit more throughout this episode why this is happening in the first place. But I guess before we get to that point, we should tackle, what's the problem with crystals or spirituality? Why can't we just manifest our way into socialism? What's the problem? Can't we be communists and also be into crystals?
Yeah, that's the thing. Marxists have a materialist philosophy which says we can understand the world without needing to rely on superstition or gods or ghosts or mystical forces, and that, the material world exists objectively outside of us, that ideas are products of the material world, and basically we need the correct ideas in order to change society. In order to change society, we need to understand it, right? And we need the correct scientific ideas to do that.
In some ways, these ideas, the religion, the new religions, all of this actually doesn't look at that material basis and is based on the intervention of God or God under another name, whether it's a spirit, whether it's a star in the sky, whether it's a crystal, or even your own brain, right? Manifesting is kind of I'm going to think really hard about something and I'm going to make it happen, These are all different forms of God by another name. And if you're waiting for some kind of divine intervention, you're actually not going to be transforming the real world around you, or not going to be doing it with the correct methods. So as Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary practice. And we stress in the Revolutionary Communists of America the need to study philosophy and the history of philosophy and Marxism in particular, which is the most advanced philosophy that humanity has produced up till now. And just to say that is why we produce a lot of books and our newspaper, The Communist, so we can explain these ideas in a simple way to our periphery, to people that we talk to on the streets. And in issue 9 of The Communist, we published this article, Marxism VS Mysticism, which Erica wrote for this issue, which is the January issue, so you can get a copy of that with the link in the description. So I think we've made it clear, we need to really correctly understand and describe the world if we're serious about changing it. And so maybe you're listening to this video, to this podcast, and you are thinking, well, I hate capitalism. I hate the way life is, and I want a way out. I'm kind of into communism and kind of into socialism, but I'm also kind of into crystals, or, I'm dabbling in different forms of religion. So should I join the party? Should I join the Revolutionary Communists of America if I'm religious?
Absolutely. If you want to change society, if you want to get rid of capitalism, if you want to get rid of exploitation and oppression, this is your party, and we want you to join. And basically, even Lenin said, if a priest comes to us to take part in our political work, that is, wants to join the party and agrees with the program that we put forward, let him in, absolutely. And the sort of any contradictions between the ideas we're putting forward and his personal beliefs, that's his business, basically, right? But no, we absolutely do not want to limit basically our recruits, the people we're working with people who are basically already convinced of atheism, of dialectical materialism, of all of it, because we know materially, like, we have to change society in order to change ideas. You know, it doesn't come from the opposite process.
Mm-hmm. And we have to build the party with the material that is provided to us by capitalism. And the thing is that religion and idealism are a fact of life under capitalism and in class society in general. And so absolutely, I think the starting point for anyone that wants to build the party of communism is agreement with the general program, that we want to overthrow capitalism through a workers' revolution, the establishment of a workers' government, the expropriation of the Fortune 500 companies in order to raise the standard of living massively. All of this, would be the starting point for anyone that wants to join the party. But then, of course, it's not like the discussion is going to end there. We do have cell meetings where we have all kinds of different discussions, interventions in the movement, and we are going to try to convince you of the philosophical outlook of dialectical materialism and its correctness. And we actually do have a number of comrades that came from a religious background and who joined the party and who, over time, working side by side with all their comrades in their struggle in their cities and around the country, have since been convinced of materialism.
My name is Teddy. I live in DC, and I joined the Revolutionary Communists of America about 7 months ago. Growing up, I lived in a Christian household, and I would say up until I was about 10 years old, I did consider myself a Christian. I had a Bible. I would read my Bible. I would pray to God every night. And then once I got a little older and started to think for myself, I realized that nobody actually had any proof that God was real. And I think from that point, for a while, I considered myself an atheist. And then when I was about a senior in high school, I had a boyfriend who gave me a copy of his Communist Manifesto and explained it to me in a way that was what communism actually was and not the Red Scare version of it that we learned in school. And funny enough, around that same time where I was learning about communism, I also started getting into spirituality. And in my mind, for a really long time, I saw spirituality as something that had a scientific basis. After learning about communism, I never went out of my way to learn more about it. I think partly because I didn't know that it was an actual movement. I thought it was just something that there were a lot of people out there like me who liked the idea, but I didn't think there was anybody actually trying to make that happen. I was really into manifesting and crystals and astrology and all that stuff. And there was a recent issue of The Communist that came out, and the centerfold was called Marxism VS Mysticism. And after reading that centerfold, I felt like a lot of my worldview kind of crumbled. And after learning more about Marxist philosophy, I look at that time in my life a lot differently. I think that I was seeking out spirituality as an escape. I think spirituality also made me very passive. I found myself just kind of manifesting a better world rather than doing anything to actually create a better world. The thing that kind of started that was one day I was manifesting and I was just kind of sitting there like, well, how is this any different than prayer, actually? I'm just sitting here kind of hoping to, maybe it's not a Christian God, but it's something that I can't prove is there. I can't prove that me sitting here manifesting, hoping with everything I have, that the world will be a better place. That's not going to make the world a better place. Before, I think when I was into spirituality, I had hope for the future, but it wasn't a material hope. It was just hope. I was hoping for a better future, and I was telling myself that if I believe it'll happen, then it will happen. But after finding Marxism and learning about Marxist philosophy, joining the RCA, I think now my hope for the future is something that has an actual material basis. I think it's really important to have your mind open to being changed, especially when you are wrong. Something that they mentioned in the article was how in times of crisis, people are a lot more likely to gravitate towards things like spirituality. And I was thinking back on that time when I was a senior in high school. Why did I gravitate towards spirituality? That was around the time that Donald Trump got elected. There were a lot of racial tensions with the police and things like that going on. And I just think it's funny that I found communism and spirituality at the same time, but ended up embracing spirituality a lot more. I think that's also because I didn't know about Marxist philosophy. Spirituality not only doesn't have a material basis in the same way that Marxist philosophy does, but also it isn't a guide to action in the way that Marxist philosophy is. But yeah, I'm really grateful that I found this organization, and I'm really excited to hopefully be able to do what that article did for me and convince some other people who consider themselves spiritual that there is a better way.
Ultimately, through transforming those material conditions and reaching socialism, the need for religion really will be undermined.
There was the sort of new atheist approach to religion of basically trying to ideologically convince people through facts and logic.
And they were very annoying. I'm so glad. There was a period they were really big and they were just so condescending. It was terrible.
Yeah, it was really awful. And so that whole experience of just trying to win people over ideologically, through facts and logic, instead of recognizing the material basis for the ideas. Lenin, in this letter, The Attitude of the Workers' Party Towards Religion, he says, "No educational book can eradicate religion from the minds of masses who are crushed by capitalist hard labor and who are at the mercy of the blind destructive forces of capitalism until those masses themselves learn to fight this root of religion, learn to fight the rule of capitalism in all its forms in a united, organized, planned, and conscious way." And so, Lenin basically called that sort of atheism, the dogmatic atheism, as bourgeois atheism, whereas we take a proletarian point of view. We want to win over the working class, and we want to support the working class in its struggles against the ruling class. Like, that is primary. The struggle against religion, that's a secondary question.
Mm-hmm. And I would say it's not like we take ambivalent view towards religion. Like, obviously, as Marxists, and we're building a cadre party at this stage, which again needs to be based on ideological clarity. We're not agnostic. We take sides, and we are materialists and we are atheists. Just to make that clear. But it's like Marx has this famous quote that everyone knows, that religion is the opium of the masses, i.e., an ideological tool that is used to kind of fool and distract from, instead of worrying about the material world, you're worried about a better life in the afterworld, in a sense. So then you're not struggling to transform society now because you're just dreaming of a better world somewhere else outside. But that's only the starting point of that quote, right? The quote actually goes on a little longer.
Yeah, the quote actually starts, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people," right? So he basically adds that after he says, like, this is a coping mechanism for the real struggles that it is to live under capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So why don't we talk a little bit more about the struggle that it is to live under capitalism, and precisely why we've seen this rise in this new form of religion, right? It's not like the institutional sort of traditional Catholic religion or Protestant religion, but it's kind of like a new sort of religion.
Yeah. I think there was an article that I saw that put it this way. Young people have grown up contending with a major recession, climate change, and a more general awareness of seeing a political and economic system that many feel hasn't benefited them. And that's sort of why they're turning to they're exploring non-traditional religious beliefs. There's another person that basically said, it was after the elections in 2016, actually. They say it was at 99% Hillary Clinton in the polls, and then it went all the way to the other side of the scale. And she just realized that what we relied on to be valid was not actually accurate. It allowed people to become more receptive to the fact that, everything isn't black and white. There's a lot of nuance there, a lot of gray areas. And so it was after that the faucet turned on for astrology.
So it's basically like you can't rely on the media, for example, to give you accurate predictions for the political system, because things are changing so quickly. And if that was true, by the way, in 2016, what would you say now in 2025, where you have the whirlwind of the Trump presidency and really the entire sort of political norm is collapsing right in front of our eyes. And already you had poll after poll that shows people don't trust the media. Why? Because it's in plain sight that they've been lying to us forever because they're capitalist media, right? That would be the Marxist explanation. But basically, people don't trust all the institutions of capitalist rule anymore. Trust in Congress, in the federal government, really are at rock bottom right now. And when you have the established ideology sort of dissipating in the context of a declining system, well, nature abhors a vacuum, and people are going to look for other explanations. So again, if the media can't predict who's going to win the election, people might turn to the stars, I guess, and this astrology stuff to try to understand and make sense of the world, right? To try to basically seek ideas that can explain what is happening in a context where people are afraid and they're having to cope with this changed reality, a new normality, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't, the first time this has happened. The tarot cards saw a similar bump in right after the 2008 crisis. And this pattern goes back not just in the 21st century, but all the way back to the origins of astrology, which took place during the decline of Greek slave society, right? A period where you had these really, really rich bureaucrats of the state blatantly flaunting massive accumulations of wealth, and alongside basically the proliferation of tons of different mystic religions and cults that worshipped a variety of gods that would supposedly grant them wealth and immortality and all number of things if they just did the right rituals, basically, if they rubbed the right crystals together in the right way. And so, we see this pattern all throughout the history of philosophy.
For the history of human thought, really, and maybe we can explore this a little bit more later as well. But just in terms of the question of institutions, it's interesting, too, that you have this rise in alternate religions, and at the same time, you actually have a collapse in institutional religions like Catholicism, the big churches. As far as I know, church membership and church attendance has actually been declining progressively for the whole 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. And the number of people that affiliate themselves with a religion has severely declined. Trust in organized religion has obviously fallen. It's dropped from 60% to just 32% in 20 years. And the number of Catholic nuns, right, people who are literally married to God, has gone down from like 180,000 to less than 42,000.
Wow.
Since
in a country of like
1965.
350 million, basically, right? So that's a tiny, tiny amount.
Yeah, exactly. The ideas that the organized religion defends stances on LGBTQ rights, women and reproductive rights, and all the sexual scandals and corruption that the church has been involved with. Obviously, you can see they're doing this to themselves. They're losing their credibility. But basically, these institutions no longer really reflect the dominant ideology in a way.
Yeah, and so in a certain sense, in the same way that other institutions are being rejected, so is the sort of traditional institutions of the church. And I think in every single aspect of the superstructure, almost, of the traditional things that used to sustain capitalist society, there's been a decline in all those things. And in a sense, it's almost like the same malaise and the same feeling and discontent that, for example, brought Trump to the White House, where he's saying, he's actually pandering to some of this skepticism. I mean, you have RFK is in his cabinet, right? And he's talking about, the COVID vaccines and a lot of other sort of giving credence to a lot of other conspiracy theories that he's talking about releasing the JFK assassination files, the MLK assassination files. So anyway, you can see there's this feeling that is finding different expressions, including, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, the rise in communism, communist ideas, revolutionary ideas. 20% of the youth in the U.S. identify with communism, support communism as a political and economic system. 10% of the overall U.S. population. And then, of course, a rise in right-wing, even racist ideas and political extremism, if you will. All of that is the ideological reflection and the political reflection of the declining material conditions of the system. And, I was reading this article the other day on the New York Times that was summarizing this. There's this study that some top think tank sort of strategists were looking at how the perception of Americans of how society is doing in the U.S., of how we are doing as a country. And the New York Times described it with the following title: "The U.S. economy is racing ahead. Almost everything else is falling behind." And they're looking at how American satisfaction with their own lives is declining and has steadily declined for the last 10, 15 years. How this country, the US, the richest country on earth, has the lowest life expectancy of any rich country, which was not true for the last 20 years. And yet, actually, life expectancy itself has been declining in the US. The US has one of the lowest rates of trust in government of any rich country in the world. But also the US ranks among the lowest in child mortality, in murder rates, in depression, suicides. The number of people trying to commit suicide has been increasing, especially for young people. And also the US is number one in the world for fatal drug overdoses in the whole world. So this is the situation that people are having to try to understand and cope with, And so when we talk about the material basis for the lack of trust in institutions, but then again, how nature abhors a vacuum, and in the absence of any mass socialist party, mass communist party, then all kinds of different ideas can fill that vacuum, and people will gravitate towards whatever it is they can find that seems to provide some kind of stability or some kind of hope, or maybe even a weight lifted off their shoulders in a sense.
Yeah, one of the basically early adopters of these new apps that's coming out with the astrology dating apps and et cetera was saying...
Wait, astrology dating app?
Yeah.
How's that work?
Because you match according to your star sign, right?
Okay.
Your compatible star sign. So for basically the article is saying, and this is a quote, "For the godless or the spiritually unaffiliated, it offers assurance of larger forces. Astrology can make you a part of something big while sweetly taking destiny out of your hands. Bigger forces are at work, and those forces are benevolent, which can be a comfort to someone living a secular life."
Mm-hmm. So you might not have a god, but your new god is going to become this astrology app. It's kind of dystopian too, that like a god is now like an algorithm in an app or whatever. But it also shows the reactionary nature too of this, because it's explicitly saying like, it's not up to you, and someone else is taking care of it. Don't worry about it,
Yeah, and let's not forget, this is a capitalist enterprise, right? There are these huge mining companies that operate in Madagascar, where most of the crystals for crystal therapy are found. And more than 80% of these crystals are mined artisanally, meaning by small groups, families, without any regulation. So child labor, free game, all of this paid at rock bottom prices, right? And this is a growing industry. In 2023, the mystical and psychic services market was valued at $2.8 billion, up from $2.2 billion in 2018. And I saw this report that was a market research report on the online psychic services, which grew really rapidly after the pandemic. It said traditional skepticism about consulting psychics has waned, with more consumers embracing these services, especially in times of uncertainty. The pandemic significantly boosted demand for services as many turned to spiritual guidance to navigate their anxieties about health, finances, and the loss of loved ones. So these psychics are basically profiting off of people's grief and their way of trying to manage the uncertainty in the world. And it's just funny that the report notes that the number of psychics has grown so significantly in the past period. The people that are born with the gift or the sight, just they obey the law of supply and demand, I guess.
Yeah, I guess in times of crisis, the number of people with the gift just magically increases. And this shows, you can have all these lofty ideas about, these crystals with these mystical powers. At the end of the day, they're material things as well, They don't come from just a world of ideas, and they need to be mined with with human, very exploited human labor. So of course, there's also the hypocrisy that goes along with it. Although I will add that if you look at the Catholic Church or some of these churches at their peak, probably their share of wealth and control over society was a lot greater than these industries. But that's a lot of money, and that's a rising industry that you're describing. But what's interesting to me is, like you said, the things that they're quoting, the reason why people are going to these psychics is concerns over healthcare and rent and incomes and housing, and ultimately it comes down to bread and butter issues, and also not just bread and butter, although I would say that's
the
probably
economy.
That's the starting point of it. I think it's like if people had a better life, they probably wouldn't be so worried about that, but also the search for a meaning in life that seems meaningless, where people seem to have no control over what they do in their day-to-day. You might work for a boss, you're exploited, and to you, what's the point of it? You're just going to work to enrich your boss ultimately, and it's like that search for meaning. I think it's natural in humans, and we can talk about that more as well, like where these ideas and where philosophy even comes from in the first place. But I just wanted to relate it to this. There was an article on the Wall Street Journal that said that sales of Bibles are booming, fueled by first-time buyers, and they cited the reason for the increase in Bible sales was worries about the economy, conflicts abroad, and uncertainty over the election that pushed readers to want to find something like the Bible, which apparently Bible sales are up 22% in the U.S. through the end of last year. So that's a pretty significant increase. But also, you can see a very clear example of, in the sort of cynical way that religion ends up being used. There was another article by the New York Times titled, "A Bible Study for the Homeless, A Search for Meaning." So it was describing how there's a lot of, obviously, a record number of homeless people in the U.S., again, a country that has 6 million empty, vacant homes. And yet there's, I think something like 700,000 homeless people, at least in this country, that don't have any dignity, any basics of life. And so they go to these shelters, and the article says they come hungry and sick. They seek meals, showers, clothes, jobs, and connections to healthcare and housing. Some also come to talk about God. That's how the article was describing it. And one of the volunteers at this shelter said their faith is raw. It's part of their survival. I.e., these people are so desperate that they have nothing else to cling to than religion. But here's the comment that really stuck out to me from this article. This is a homeless center that has a $2.9 million budget in Fairfax County, which is apparently one of the most unequal counties, or one that has one of the highest, is one of the country's richest counties. And the article says, but few of them express class anger or ask why God permits their suffering. I.e., people go here and they find God, and they don't ask the tough questions like, why are there so many rich people in this county, and why are we so poor? So explicitly this shows how this can actually be used as an outlet to divert potential class anger and class rage. As we saw, there's probably unprecedented levels of class rage in the U.S. You saw that with the response to the killing of United Healthcare CEO. And it's pretty convenient for the ruling class if people start to instead, seek solace in God instead of expressing their class rage in whichever way,
Hi, my name is Grace, and I am a member of the Revolutionary Communists of America in Dallas, Texas. As a kid, I was raised Catholic, and as many of you listening may know, being raised Catholic comes with a lot of rules and a lot of beliefs. Of course, there's good beliefs like being loving and kind to your neighbors, treating them as you treat yourself. But when you talk about more complicated issues, such as international conflicts, the genocide in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, the mass exploitation of the working class, and the healthcare system, amongst many other issues, that Catholic analysis starts to break down. You start to get, well, these people are evil, or, well, they're not Catholic, or the issues in the world are caused by, a lack of faith. I guess around a year ago when I joined, I was still kind of a devout Catholic. Still, some of those contradictions were coming to the fore, especially being a queer person in Texas who sees these issues. However, this was not yet apparent to me. At the time, I was still considering myself Catholic. I was still going to Mass and participating in everything I could in the church and still believing it at some level. About halfway through, so 6 months ago, I had started to really put myself in a place where I could actually contribute more to the party, where I was able to take a leading role. And with that came the study of Marxist theory. I remember distinctly one of the first books I actually touched, of long books that weren't just classics, was Reason and Revolt by Alan Woods and Ted Grant. And something that was elucidating, really inspiring when I started to read that, was the idea of the dialectical method and the origin of religion and kind of just the philosophy of Marxism. The world impacts our mode of thought. It impacts who we are as people. Whereas religion comes from an idealist mode, and a mode where the idea impacts who we are as people. So people are fundamentally evil, fundamentally good. And that was a big eye-opener, really. I started to realize that I had been taught all my life that people were inherently something, but I could see scientifically that this is not the case. People are forced into these conditions. And so that was kind of the start of the unraveling of my religious beliefs. As I continued to study the faith and also study Marxism, I had more and more realized, where do I disagree with my faith? Where do I agree with Marxism? And that helped me to come to the realization that I was not Catholic anymore. The only way that we can fix the ills of society is to build socialism. There was a struggle to kind of comprehend and grasp the ideas. There were discussions with more experienced comrades in my area. And as I developed, as I learned, I came to these conclusions of Marxism. Whether it's Catholicism, whether it's mysticism, whatever kind of idealist belief, there's no solution. And the only way that we can change the world is through scientific socialism. It's through Marxism. It's through the revolutionary communist of America.
So again, that you can see it's a reactionary role that idealism, religion plays in the context of at a time when class struggle and class anger is on the rise.
Yeah, I mean, just a little anecdote to add to that is you can buy crystals to help you fight the patriarchy, right?
Wow.
It's the same type of thing, if you're busy basically paying money for these crystals, again, likely mined with child labor, you're not looking for ways to really materially change reality.
And I would say there's a similar thing here with the conspiracy theory stuff, because all of these things, the question of the JFK files and the MLK files, for example, there's a lot of grains of truth in this. When people have dissatisfaction and lack of confidence in government institutions, they're right to feel that way. This is true. These are corrupt institutions that do not represent the interest of the working class and that have all kinds of funny business going on. I mean, the role that the CIA, the FBI have played, a counter-revolutionary role with, spy networks and all of this. Oh, absolutely. But then with these conspiracy theory rabbit holes, instead of looking at capitalism, the system itself, a system where you have a minority of parasitic billionaires at the top exploiting the labor of the majority of society, which is the working class. That would be our explanation for all these things. And then you have the state, the bodies of armed men, and all the institutions that serve those interests of the ruling class. But instead of looking at that, they look at some kind of cabal of lizard people, or you look at one particular, whether sometimes it's anti-Semitism, it's Jewish people, or, it's this or it's that, instead of actually tackling the class root of this problem,
Yeah, exactly. And you see this rise of skepticism generally in a declining system. And skepticism really it's just a simple rejection. It says to doubt and question everything, because you can't trust the government. You can't trust the institutions that have held up this or propped prop up the system, and it makes people open to new ideas like socialism, like communism, but it doesn't actually give you the tools of uncovering what actually is true, and that's why it sort of leads to these conspiracy theories, because there's no method behind it for actually putting forward something positive. For example, you do see this rise in flat Earth theory. That saw a big revival in 2020. 24% of adults in the U.S. believe they have seen a flying saucer, and 34% of Americans polled in 2022 believe that these UFOs are proof of alien life, and this is up from just 20% in 1996. So you do see this proliferation of relative proliferation of conspiracy theories, because skepticism, it's not a method, it's just a rejection, it's just a negative. It doesn't put forward something positive in its place.
And generally, too, what you have is that there's a lot of eclecticism as well, right? So you might take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, or a little bit of this philosophy, a little bit of that religion, put it all together, and that's going to be my personal worldview or whatever. And at the end of the day, look, as Marxists, we say there's ideas that correctly, accurately reflect how the world function and how society functions, and there's ideas that don't. And there is a truth. A truth can be found through science, through experiment. But then, of course, those theories get over time as you can develop science more, new techniques, and new, whatever, the telescope and microscope and all of this, nuclear reactors, whatever, that allow you to deepen the exploration of the world, that reject those theories, right? And that's how truth basically becomes, over time, more and more truer, in a sense, and more accurate reflection of the functionings of the world. But then there's ideas that are rejected, that are rebuked. And I would say 100% astrology, the crystal stuff, witchcraft, tarot, all of this. There's no scientific basis for any of these things. And, I think the question of lack of trust in science itself has actually been in the up and up. Like, there's been an increase in people that reject official science and look for alternative medicine and stuff like that, which is, I think, again, part of the same process.
Yeah, and that's definitely a complicated question, because you have this really ambiguous unity between science as a method, as a sort of the belief in materialist point of view and a material world, because really, like, science is ultimately just, it is based on a materialist philosophy. It assumes that the universe exists outside of our heads, that we can actually understand it, and the whole history of science is this progressing from ignorance to knowledge. But of course, science in our society, it's institutionalized. It's made up, like, scientists are men and women that exist, not in ivory towers, but in the same world as the rest of us, right? And so science as an institution, that's associated with big pharma. That's associated with, the media that also lies, right? Because that's where the scientific discoveries are sort of being communicated through, right? And so it is kind of all mixed up that way. And so, the trust in science definitely saw a dip with the pandemic, as you got so many convoluted, confusing messages about the pandemic and the vaccines and everything like that. And so its credibility is tied to the system.
Mm-hmm. But of course, it's not like we reject science and the scientific method, but we understand there are class interests tied up with all of that, because, again, like you said, scientists and science does not exist in a vacuum. And, like, take big pharma, for example. Absolutely, they pump money into the research and development of medicine, and that absolutely has an impact on whether people get cured or not. I mean, they had this whole industry of opioids, which they spread all kinds of lies, like you're not gonna get addicted to opioids if you take them. This whole, like, pain medicine school, where it's like, you don't have to live with pain, just take these pills and there's no secondary effects. And now you have the opioid epidemic, which Now Trump is blaming on immigrants, right? And he's saying, "Oh, the fentanyl is brought in from these immigrants." Well, no, look, this was propped up by the U.S. pharmaceutical industry that paid doctors, that paid for whole research institutions to justify this. And you see this with so many things. I mean, smoking used to be like, "Oh, you can smoke, that's fine," and literally like the medical research proved this until it didn't, because obviously it became so blatant that they couldn't continue to lie anymore. So it's normal that people should not trust big pharma. It's gonna make it really hard for anyone to know what's true and what's not. And that's where the gray area comes in for the conspiracy theories, for the RFK type figures, to take advantage of that basically and divert it to channels that don't really threaten the class basis of the system.
Yeah, and that's not even touching on the fact that ultimately all science is funded through research, through programs, through public and private grants. And so ultimately it is all at the behest of profit and the profit motive. And so its entire existence right now is tied to like being able to secure profits for the capitalists. And of course, that's going to take research in a particular direction. That it is also going to motivate, corruption in science of falsifying results and data and everything else that comes with that. But as a method of understanding the world, the materialist philosophy that says, we can understand reality and there is objective truth. And like that is we absolutely support.
These ideas, we said, they're just like science proves that the crystal magic doesn't exist. You can't rub crystals and get them to do these magical things. Or astrology is a very old idea, but it's also a very incorrect idea. Where do these ideas even come from? Like, what are the origins of idealism, materialism, all these terms that we're throwing around, and how do those ideas make it all the way to the 21st century?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really begins with like why we have a philosophy, right? As a species, because what other animals have philosophies? And life evolved on Earth. Our primate ancestors dropped out of trees. We stood upright, and our hands were freed up to use tools. Our diets changed. All of our evolution went about in a particular process because of our environment. We began to use language to understand how these tools work and communicate how they worked. We learned how to learn. We learned how to plan and improve, and really how to we were grasping at a way to shape our environment, and our survival as a species really depend on more and more on this like compulsion to understand the world.
Which is, of course, a social process. Like, none of this was one person in isolation, but rather it was out of necessity, the need to collaborate, to work together, to transform our environment through the use of tools and making new tools and better tools collectively. And I would say that collective process has only become more and more complex, more advanced, and much more we're much more interdependent. There's a worldwide division of labor, compared to those early societies that you were referring to.
Yeah, this was a process that took hundreds of thousands of years. This was not just, someone waking up one day with the brilliant idea to chisel a hammer or something. But yeah, in this early period of human history, religion kind of marked a step forward in our consciousness, in our evolution, because it was a reflection of our desire to shape the world, to take the place of all of the forces of nature that we still thought of as mysterious and out of our control, right? We assigned agency to the sun, the stars, the rain. All of it was, because it was out of our control, but our survival depended on it. We assigned them, spirits and gods. And these very early religions, this like animism period in history, it's an expression of human agency.
So basically, for the first time in this period, you said the early history, in Marxist terms, normally would even describe this as the prehistory of our species, before the rise of class societies and all of this, where for the first time, humans try to find explanations for the natural phenomena around them. And because they didn't have the knowledge, the tools, the technology, the technique to actually study that scientifically, they just came up with supernatural causes like, okay, the rain. You'll dance to pray to the rain god to cause rain. And it was a very instrumental kind of religion. Like you actually are just trying to get the result that you need in order to survive. And in a sense, that was progressive, like from objectively speaking, in terms of the history of our species, because it represents the first time that humans try to find those explanations, which, like you said, other animals don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. Rain dances are a really excellent example of this because you see rain dances in cultures or rain ceremonies in cultures all across the world, basically wherever rain was infrequent, and it is an attempt at getting nature to do what we want it to do, what we need it to do for our survival.
But really, from that sort of early beginning of humans trying to make sense of the world, from there, over time, you have the actual beginning of science, which is, the true history of scientific thought really starts when humans get rid of that mythology and try to obtain a rational understanding of nature without divine intervention. And now we're talking about like those early Greek philosophers that were materialists and who, came up with different ideas for what is matter made of, what is what's the primal element of matter, different elements. Basically, of course, a lot of their explanations, like even the early atomists and so all of this, they came up with the idea of atoms, and it was a very abstract idea. They didn't have microscopes to actually, get a sense of what atoms are and how matter is organized. But again, over time, you start to develop these tools that allow us to gain a more and more and more correct and rational understanding of all those things. And we don't need to pray for rain anymore because we understand weather patterns and we understand how clouds form and stuff like that.
We built aqueducts.
We built aqueducts, and you can, and the Romans built aqueducts, not just, in modern capitalist society. So you can see that now, of course, have we arrived at the eternal truth? And I would say, no, there is no such thing. That if you're looking for one truth that is valid forever and that's it, and that's the final answer, you're looking for a God. The point is, this is an infinitely complex universe. It's an infinite universe, and knowledge itself and truth is a process, and it's a historic process that we can basically continuously have a closer and closer approximation and better theories that correspond to actual reality that explain how matter is organized and how matter evolves and changes. Engels explains this, how those old ideas, religion, and this idealist conception has a prehistoric stock of what we should call today bunk. These various false conceptions of nature, of man's own being, of spirits, magic forces, etc., have, for the most part, only a negative economic basis of low economic development. But all of that basically is carried over in a contradictory way to the present period at this time of crisis. But then he explains the history of science is the history of the gradual clearing away of this nonsense or of its replacement by fresh, but already less absurd nonsense, which I think is a great way to describe the process of the scientific method. And actually, if you want to read more about this process of the development of human knowledge, I would recommend this fantastic issue of our theoretical magazine, the In Defense of Marxism magazine. And this particular issue, 48, is all about science, progress, crisis, and revolution. And the editorial in particular is titled, "What is Truth?" And it really explains this very, very well. Now, one could say, how do we go from there to the fact that, look, these ideas, have been disproven, and yet they're still here. Doesn't that mean there's something must be correct?
I think we can undoubtedly say that human society has undergone an evolution just as we have undergone a biological evolution. And I think it's very fashionable today to deny that there has been any progress in society. And superficially, right, you could say, looking at the world, right, we had astrology way back in ancient Greece. We have it today, so there's been no progress. But that's an extremely superficial way of looking at the world. We have made progress. We have gained a greater and greater understanding about how the world works, how the laws, basically patterns of the universe, to be able to make predictions and shape our environment, right? and we haven't completed that process. We're going to continue to make new discoveries, new technologies and advances, and the problem isn't that we've learned all there is to know and there's no progress. The problem really is that there's a crisis in capitalism, and capitalism needs to be overthrown.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think often you can, when people see the end of a system, but either, like, for example, in the eyes of the ruling class, they don't understand that their system is not eternal and is not going to go on forever. And instead you see the end of the world, or the end of history, or the end of science, or whatever, when really it's the system itself that is in decline and that needs to go. And you can only understand that if you actually study history with a dialectical materialist lens, right? A historical materialism. And you can understand the rise and fall of all these different socioeconomic systems. And one important thing to understand about this, the history of knowledge and human thought in general, is that it doesn't develop in a straight line. Like when we talk about progress, we're not talking about a linear, mechanical, smooth progress that it gets better and better every year until like forever, but actually it develops through contradiction, and in a contradictory fashion. You have some idea put forward, other ideas come along that contradict that original idea, and then a third idea may come in that contradicts that second idea, and so it seems like we're back at the beginning, but really over time you have the accumulation of those different theories and the sifting through and rejecting incorrect things and correct things eventually leads to a sharpening. But you also go through periods of reaction where you don't have any good ideas being put forward, and that's absolutely part of that process. Like, for example, during the Middle Ages represented, historically speaking, the destruction of centuries of very good and correct human, science, and of correct materialist ideas, and all of this was destroyed. And in a sense, it's almost had to start from scratch during the Renaissance. And yet, by taking the ideas from the previous period, from the ancient Greeks, from ancient Rome, and reviving them, they were able to be revived in some ways on a higher level on the basis of the technique and technology that we have today. So again, you can see it's not a smooth line. You go through all kinds of twists and turns, but that's kind of like an upward spiral in a sense, right? We would say this is like, dialectics. That is precisely how progress happens, is through contradiction, not in a smooth sort of mechanical way.
Yeah, exactly. And biological evolution also goes through a similar process as the process of the evolution of human society, right? It's not linear. It was thought to be very gradual, step by step. But
like if you think about like Darwin and Darwin's theory of evolution, right? It was kind of like that.
Yeah, it was thought to be very gradual, but the more we uncover, the more it's very clear that it's not gradual at all. There are these like sudden leaps, basically. There are mass extinction events, right? There are species that they proliferate and they grow so much that they outcompete themselves and they lead themselves to their own extinction, essentially, right? So it's full of these very contradictory processes as well. This is dialectical materialism. This is the method through which the universe actually works.
Mm-hmm. And that's and Marxism, the philosophy of Marxism, is dialectical materialism, which is the world outlook or the framework that allows us to accept those contradictions as opposed to try to eliminate them, which is what formal logic would try to do. And going back to this question of, there's periods of retreat, and where actually correct ideas might get destroyed or replaced by ideas that are not so correct or not so progressive. We're talking about the period we're going through now. It's not the first time that economic system is entering into decline. In the period of the collapse of the Roman Empire, that's probably the best example, where you had that sense of doom of a disintegrating social fabric and all kinds of cults and religious sects and so forth filling that ideological vacuum, including, by the way, all kinds of Oriental cults like the cult of Mithra and the cult of Isis and Osiris, but also the cults that have become more popularly known today, such as Judaism and Christianity, which were just two among a huge amount, like hundreds of different religious cults that emerged in that period of the disintegration of the Roman Empire.
People can read more about this in the class struggle in the Roman Republic, and to see the parallels between that and the decline of U.S. imperialism today, can't recommend enough our new book, Colossus, on the decline of U.S. imperialism.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think there's a lot of parallels. Even if you look at the philosophies and the ideas that were coming out at the time, that pervading sense of decay that affected not just the sort of popular masses, but also the ruling class in Rome, also found this philosophical expression that was a lot of, like cynicism and skepticism, which, by the way we use those terms today is different from the philosophical trends of the time. But those were basically ideological expressions of that feeling of weariness, of moral decadence, of disgust with the way the system was, which was a system that had outlived itself. At that time, by the way, you also had an increase in suicides, which unfortunately there's a parallel with the situation today. It even became fashionable for people in at that period of the Roman Empire to kill themselves. But in general, you saw a turn toward an inward-looking tendency, a turn toward mysticism, towards irrationality, and also the possibility of even being able to know anything. That's cynicism, the philosophy, the philosophical trend, and subjective idealism, this idea that only I exist and everything depends on my subjective impressions and that there is no objective truth. Those were trends that they're not new. You see this today. They've been repackaged in different ways, even from like people like Kant and Hume that also express some of these ideas in one form or another, but you can trace it all the way back to those periods of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So they're not new ideas. They might just be repackaged in more fancy sort of academic language.
For example, today with postmodernism, it says there hasn't been any progress. And I think the proof to the contrary of that is that our understanding of the world has really increased throughout the past thousands of years through the progress of science. But also this idea that there's no objective truth, that your truth is different from my truth, and we all live in our own completely separate realities apart from each other.
My experience, can't know each other. Right? Yeah. I can only know the world through my experience. Therefore, there's many truths. Actually, there's infinite truth. Your truth is as valid as my truth. And so if a tree falls in the forest, but I'm not there, it's not part of my reality. It's not part of my narrative that tree fell and made a sound or didn't make a sound. Yeah, you can see how this is absolutely leading us nowhere, and it would lead to basically the conclusion that the world doesn't exist, only I exist, and therefore what is there to change? There's no world to change, no material reality to transform, and it plays a very reactionary role.
Well, and this is the most pure form that I feel like is manifesting today, right? You just have to imagine something hard enough and you can create it within your reality. But I think with any amount of experience in attempting this, it's
you can. I guess a lot of people will convince themselves that it's happening, But yeah, I think sooner or later it gets disproven.
Ultimately, like the dominant ideology of a society is the ideology of the ruling class, and when that society that the ruling class is presiding over it goes into crisis, it goes into decline, then that ideology also goes into decline. These mystical ideas are a coping mechanism. People are looking for a way to change their circumstances, but what they're being given is these star charts and rocks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I really like the way Alan Woods puts it in his History of Philosophy book. He said, this is the philosophy of despair. And I think that's a perfect way to capture, the kind of ideology that's coming out. And not just ideology or philosophy, by the way. Also, even in popular culture, you have apocalyptic movies about the end of the world, Black Mirror, about technology taking over and destroying the human race. All these things are the ideological reflection of the death agony of capitalism. And I guess maybe we can go into what do we propose in terms of, you have the rise of these religious sort of obscurantist ideas, the astrology and all of this. how can we change that, and how can we get people to recognize the material world and how to transform it?
Instead of what idealism does, which is to start from ideas and see the world as a product of ideas, Marxism does the very reverse. It looks at the world as it is, right? And it doesn't use a scripture, a schema, right? It's a method that we use to look at the world and to discover from it the patterns, laws in order to change it. If we can understand revolutions, why they happen, how they happen, what can help them succeed or fail, basically the science of history, then we can prepare to overthrow capitalism. Then we can organize the working class under the direction of a party that can take on this system and basically build a new world of socialism.
Absolutely. So, Marx put it very well. He said that only material force can change material force. We're materialists, and we understand that that's absolutely true. But ideas themselves become material force when they grasp the masses, And that's the point. Like Marxism, for us, revolutionary communists, that's our guide to action. And, we also understand, though, it's not about just like preaching Marxism to every single individual and change their minds one by one, right? In order to like convince them all that capitalism bad, socialism good, and we need to organize for revolution, right? We understand the way that consciousness changes is not through those kinds of individual interactions, but again, through material conditions. Material conditions determine consciousness, and there is no shortage of material conditions affecting consciousness today, all the crises that we're seeing, Trumpism itself, the problems of life under capitalism are pushing millions and millions of people to question the way the world is and to look for an answer. And that is the role of the parties to provide that answer.
Yeah, basically, capitalism does 99% of the work for us by exposing itself, by going into these crises and demonstrating its very decline, right? It does a lot of the work for us, but that 1% left, right, of really organizing, a party that can be the real organized expression of that inclination to change our conditions. And with this method of dialectical materialism, through understanding scientifically how the world changes, we see how that, not as individuals, but as a class, we can actually change our circumstances and change the world.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. The working class is the class that produces that's a scientific understanding that Marxism awards us, that the working class is the class in society that produces all the wealth that exists. And once the working class grasps this fact and moves to take control over its own lives, there is nothing that can stop it, because the working class is the vast majority of the population. And so we have the numbers on our side. We have a correct understanding of this process on our side. The thing that we do not have on our side is the size of the party, as in we are too small to have a mass impact. But our aim is to build a mass communist party. And if you agree with our ideas, you should absolutely join, help us in this task. And only when the working class establishes a workers' government, expropriates the billionaires, and uses that wealth to lift everyone up materially, will that be the material precondition for the free thinking of every individual, for the free expression of every individual, and also, yes, the material undermining of religion, obscurantism, mysticism, and all that old bunk, as Engels would call it.